Good day. Uh, Welcome to another session on the basic concepts in assessment and learning. And in this video, I will be discussing another type of assessment, the traditional and authentic measurement or assessment rather. Uh, and also, I'll be discussing on the last part of this video the difference between criterion reference and norm reference measurement. So for now, let us deal with the first two uh, concepts that we will be discussing. So assessment attaches much importance to any sort of teaching learning process. The usual and common teaching assessment we do is what we know as the traditional assessment, or some call it as the conventional assessment. Today, we should use authentic assessment to keep pace with the growing necessities of the world. So the comparison of authentic assessment and the traditional assessment reveals that different purposes are served, as evidences by the nature of the assessment and the item response format. So, for example, we can teach students how to do mathematics, learn history and science, not just to know them. Then, to assess what our students have learned, we can ask students to perform tasks that replicate the challenges faced by those using mathematics, doing history, or conducting scientific investigation. So to start with, what is really this traditional assessment? So the traditional assessment requires students to select or supply the correct answers to questions which the teacher asks. So it follows selecting a response from learners, where the authentic assessment engages learners to perform tasks on the basis of item they are informed. So uh, comparing it to the other type of assessment, in the traditional assessment, this is the one that requires us to provide answer. Just example, multiple choice, uh, selected, short uh, answer test. Ano pa? We have matching type, for example. Okay, these are what we actually employs in the paper and pencil test. So the paper and pencil tests are used for us to check knowledge, attitudes, and skills. So, however, very limited ang kayang ma-measure ng traditional assessment in terms of attitudes and skills. So, that's why we have the presence of the authentic assessment. So, the authentic assessment has something to do with the uh, performance-based task. Okay, so or real-world tasks, for example. Students are being asked to perform on real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of the essential knowledge and skills. So they have several advantages over traditional or conventional assessment. So they are likely to be more valid, particularly for learning outcomes that require higher order thinking skills. So I would like to highlight again that this requires students to perform real-world tests. Okay, it employs performance tests and portfolio assessment. And what else? What else did I miss? So it is said that because they are involving real-world tasks, they are also likely to be more interesting for students and more motivating. And they provide more specific and usable information about what students have succeeded in learning, as well as what they have not learned. So that's authentic assessment. So keyword natin for authentic assessment, here are types of assessment that requires students to perform real-world tasks. So what are the differences between traditional assessment and authentic assessment? So actually, both of them are have this learning outcomes are measured and evaluated. Of course, both of them have this particular learning targets that we measure. Then, students are asked to supply or select or supply a response for traditional, whilst in authentic, instead of supplying only their responses, they are now performing the tasks or construct their own responses. Okay? Like, for example, an essay type of test is an example of authentic assessment if its purpose is for you to allow students to organize or summarize their thoughts. No? It's an example of activity that it's a paper and pencil test, however, it can be authentic because uh, it's a different um, activity that requires students to organize their ideas. So in traditional assessment, only one correct answer is encouraged or accepted, while in authentic assessment, uh, there is an acceptable variety of tasks or strategies, and these are being encouraged and accepted. In traditional assessment, it is said to have a contrived setup for testing. No? Pag sinabing contrived setup, it is uh, giving you not necessarily the direct experience, but it is just a simulation of what is direct. Okay? While in the authentic assessment, uh, real-world learning is being encouraged kasi actual yung pinaperform mo sa authentic assessment. So, tests are usually devised by the teacher in the traditional assessment. So, authentic assessment, it can be both, no? Forms of assessment can be devised by the teacher or in collaboration with the students. So, pwedeng pag-usapan, pwedeng gawin yan together with the students. So, the traditional assessment limited yung development of the higher thinking skills. While in authentic assessment, since real-world tasks yan, there's this great extent in the development of higher order thinking skills. In the traditional assessment, teacher alone evaluates students' output, while in the authentic assessment, it provides opportunity for students to evaluate his or her own work. So the student can have the checklist or rating skills for the student to determine how he is doing, no? How he or she is doing. In traditional assessment, I missed that versus. This is an example of a question. Where is the Philippines located? So of course, there is this options A, B, C. Okay, ganyan yung tipo ng tanong for traditional assessment. While if you have this particular objective of knowing where the Philippines is located, you can have this example of authentic assessment. You get a world map and allow students to point the location of the Philippines. That is an example of an authentic assessment, having the same objective, no, in determining if the students know how to locate the Philippines in the map or in the world. So another example, in traditional assessment, we might be asking this one. When we mix blue and yellow, what color is produced? So of course, you will give another options. Then in authentic assessment, this is what students will do. Get a scoop of yellow and blue paint, mix them, then ask students to tell what color is being produced. So that's an example of an authentic assessment. Next, what will you do if your brother sprained an ankle? So then again, you have options. Apply a cold compress. B, raise his foot. C, call a physician. So that is an example again of a traditional assessment test. While in authentic, here's what you can do. You can pretend that someone has sprained his ankle, for example, your brother or your classmates. No? Demonstrate the first aid measure you will do. So, titingnan mo ngayon kung ano ang talagang gagawin niya pag gano'n ang pangyayari. So, it's easy for us to say what are we going to do if we know the concept. But, if we are in the actual situation, dito mo makikita kung talagang alam niya kung anong gagawin. So that's an example of authentic. Then we have another one. What do you use in tossing a ball in volleyball? So anong gagamitin daw? Fingers, feet, knee. So in authentic assessment, here's what you will do. Here's what you're going to ask your students to do. Demonstrate how to toss a ball in volleyball. So the teacher then will observe and use a scoring guide to measure students' performance. So those are the differences between a traditional assessment and authentic assessment. I hope you don't have questions, or I hope you understand the differences between the two. Next, we have the criterion reference measurement versus norm reference measurement. This is very short. I just want to introduce the terminologies. So when we say criterion reference, it is the type of measurement of evaluation or assessment, whatever type or term you're going to call it. For as long as we are referring to the criterion reference, we mean here that it determines a student's status in a clearly defined set of related tasks. And it describes what learning tasks an individual can do. So in the criterion reference test, for example, it compares a person's knowledge or skills against a predetermined standard, learning goal, performance level, or other criterion. So with this criterion reference test, each person's performance is compared directly to the standard without considering how other students perform on the test. Again, without considering how other students perform on the test. It's only your performance compared it to the standard. Okay? Criterion reference tests often used to cut scores, to place students into categories such as basic, proficient, and advanced. So, an example here. Students can assemble the parts of a microscope. So, tells what a student can do without reference to the performance of the other students. So, ang usapan lang dyan, kung kaya ba ng estudyante na i-assemble yung parts of the microscope. Okay? So, here's a figure. So in the criterion reference test, again, it compares students' knowledge and skills against a predetermined standard, CAT scores, or other criterion. In the criterion reference test, the performance of other students does not affect a student's score. So that is what we mean by criterion reference test. For the norm reference measurement, it determines a student's status compared with that of others on a given task. So ito naman, yung type of measurement, if you're going to compare the performance with the other students or with the other one who's performing the same task. It provides students relative standing among other students. So norm reference measures compared a person's knowledge or skills to the knowledge or skills of the norm group. The composition of the norm group depends on the assessment. For students' assessment, the norm group is often a nationally representative sample of several thousand of students in the same grade. So, dapat pare-pareho yung grupo na pinag-uusapan natin or kinokomperan natin ng kanilang performance. So, if we are comparing students' performance, dapat dun sa same level niya, same grade level, for example. So other norm groups may also be narrowed by age, by the status, no, socioeconomic level, their race, and ethnicity. So kung ano yung basis for comparison mo, dapat pare-pareho. Yun kasi yung pag-uusapan niyo in terms, or yun yung magiging basis nyo in terms of the norm. So, then an example is given here. Example, Pedro is the highest in the mathematics test in a class of 50. So here you will see there is already a comparison. No? kino-compare yung performance ni Pedro with that of the performance of the students in a class of 50. So, sinasabi dyan, Pedro is the highest. So, kinompare siya. Hindi mo kasi masasabing highest siya without comparing it with the others. Okay? I hope that is clear. So again, norm reference test compares the student's performance against the performance of their peers. So I hope I made it clear kung yung difference between criterion reference and norm reference. And that's all for this section. I'll be seeing you on the next video. Good day, class.